Hey everybody, Riot Mort here after a long winter break. It's been a while since we've had a patch, and we are here with the patch 14.1 rundown. Welcome to 2024. It's been a while. So generally when the meta sits for this long, even if it's a good meta, it kind of gets solved a bit. We know the things people are struggling with, things like true damage emblem, AD flex, yada yada, and we know the things we want to be more successful. With this patch, there's quite a bit going on here, but it's a big focus on generally trying to make more things successful and more things played in a healthy way. So you'll see some of that in some of our system changes. But yeah, so it is a big patch. There's a lot to go into. So let's dive right in because I don't want to be here for hours. All right, first up, headliners. So headliners had a rule that we added at the last minute where if more than half the pool was gone, you couldn't hit a headliner. It did its job, which was preventing this whole, sell for your headliner and hit a 3-star 4-cost and 5-cost. But it was really confusing. It felt like hidden knowledge that players didn't know, things like that. So we're trying to simplify. Oh, the other thing it did is that, like, let's say 2 players in your lobby found an Ari. You were just screwed. If you really wanted to play Ari, you couldn't play it anymore. It just was completely out of the question. So we're adjusting the rule now to be a lot simpler and easier to understand. Basically, for 1, 2, and 3 costs, there's no restrictions. If there are only 3 Yones left in the pool, he can still show up as a headliner, no problem. There's no restrictions whatsoever. For 4-cost and 5-cost champions, the restriction is if you own more than 4 copies or 3 copies, 4 for 4 cost, 3 for 5 cost, then you can't see the headliner. Again, this is mostly to prevent the I find 6 Zacks, sell my headliner, buy headliner Zack. That's what it's there to prevent. But otherwise, so again, that example where 2 other players have Ari, you could still hit Ari. It's just you. Should be a simpler rule, should be more intuitive, and should be easier to understand. So hopefully this makes headliner system even better. All right, next change is a bit of a controversial one, but streaks. So one of the things we've seen in the beginning of the game, stage 2, is stage 2 is where you don't really have a ton of agency. You kind of hit a bunch of pairs and have a bunch of 2-stars, or you don't and you have a weak board. The problem is for the win streaker and the loss streaker, they were up a lot of gold, and that could make a big impact with compound interest in the way it works. Meanwhile, if you went win, loss, win, loss, win, you were kind of screwed. So we're kind of taking that low end, win, loss, win, loss, win, and the high end of perfect streaking, and we're bringing it down. We're bringing down the impact of streaks. Streaks are still there. There's still some additional bonus gold, but it shouldn't feel like a game is decided based off who streaked in the early game. So this will lower that impact. It might not be the perfect version, but we do want to try this with the lower impact of streaks. There could be a world where we go back to like 2 through 4, 5, 6, something like that, but we'll keep an eye on it. But that's the main reason we're doing that. Next up, something that's been in our game for a long time is ties, right? This could be 2 players open forting, or this could be, just a sudden death happening, things like that, because combat went long. Hilariously enough, we never actually sat down and designed what is the rule for a tie. We kind of just accepted that it was random, except it wasn't really random. It was whoever traveled to the other player's board, which is nonsense. It's just a nonsense rule. It made no sense. So we decided to finally give it a rule, and the rule is if players tie in any way, both players will take player damage like they lost, and to prevent the issue that would cause this to just be like an open fort meta, or it'd be advantageous because like both players would get a loss streak, it actually just resets your streak completely to 0. So for example, if you both have a target dummy, yep, it'll be a tie, your streaks get reset, no cheating it. Now, you might ask the question, well, doesn't this just mean you play a 1-star Nami? Yeah, you could just play a 1-star Nami, and that's okay. We're not trying to get rid of loss streaking at all, but we are trying to make it clear. This is about designing a clear rule, and so now there will be a clear rule here. And even in the 1-star Nami case, at least the combat will resolve, and there's still some risk. Finally, the last one here is we made an emblem adjustment. Country, we like that players can be able to play with 7 country, but it just wasn't accessible enough. And Jazz was really just too strong to be that accessible. If Jazz is tuned in a healthy state, which Jazz was kind of weak this patch, but we saw when Jazz was strong, Spatula plus Cloak is just a lot of generic power. So We decided to swap them, so now country, excuse me, country is now the buildable one, which means you can get 7 country more often. Jazz is uncraftable, and you'll see some balance adjustments later in the patch to make up for that. All right, continuing on. New portals. So when we launched the set, we explicitly were like, we want to make sure for the start of the set, the portals are relatively low impact, right? They're things that aren't going to change the game too much so that you could focus on headliners and all the new units. Well, it's been a month and a half. Time to crank it up a notch. And so these portals are definitely about cranking it up a notch and letting some more fun stuff happen. If you're one of those like overly competitive players, they're like, these are all for fun portals. Yeah, kinda. Not that's intentional. So I'll run through them real quick. Spatula, start with the spatula. Yep, cool. Tactician's Crown. Yep, +1 unit, easy. Support Anvil. Yep, get a support item. Crescendo. This is going to be augments in the game will be silver, gold, prismatic. Not a favorite of mine, but Decrescendo, reverse order, prismatic, gold, silver. No problem. Champion Delivery. You might remember this as Yordle Portal or Flushing Arena. Twice per stage, gain a high-cost champion. So some extra gold. Pretty cool. Radiant Blessing. At 40 health, get a blessing that contains powerful loot. Cool, that's back. Treasure Armory. These are treasure dragons. At 4/5, choose a 5-piece package of powerful loot. This does include the Radiant and Shadow ones, so they're back like normal. Wandering Trainers. This is a new one you've never seen before. This one's a little wild. This is probably the most for fun. If you're playing in a tournament, I don't recommend picking Wandering Trainers. But everyone gets a training dummy with 3 permanently attached emblems. It's 3 random emblems. It can't repeat. But you could end up with, I don't know, Disco, Dazzler, and Hyperpop. Or you could end up with Edgelord, Rapid Fire, whatever, So enjoy that. Could be a pretty fun game. Loot subscription. You might remember this as Hall of the Nine. This is another pretty zany one where every stage gain a random loot from a highly varied pool. Could be a boot, could be a Tome of Traits, could be a spatula, could be many things. But this is the old Hall of the Nine. And then finally, one of my favorites here, Crab Rave. Dancing crabs replace monsters and drop bonus loot, but crabs on stage 5+ are extremely dangerous. So basically, it's Scuttle Puddle, but the crabs are dancing, which is hilarious and cute. But when you get to stage 5, you might lose a PvE match. You better have some health because it can kick your butt. So big giant dancing crabs do a lot of damage. So 11 new portals. Give them a try. Should spice up the game a bit. And yeah, especially if you're looking for some wild games. All right, on the traits side, 8-bit was a trait that you basically were like, if I happen to be playing Corki or Caitlyn or Riven, cool, I'm glad it's active, but you weren't really excited about it. And the actual benefit, if you compare it to something like Big Shot, for example, was really kind of laughable considering you had to stack it. So we're putting power in the trait, and you'll see later we're pulling it out of some of the champions. But we want the trait to be exciting. We want the emblem to be like something you're excited to put on somebody else. So 8-bit goes up from 4.5, 7.5, 12 to 5, 9, 14. Pretty big buff at 4. I think that's the biggest impact one here. Crowd Diver. Crowd Diver was in this weird position where like 2 Crowd Diver was kind of a joke. I don't know why you were playing 2 Crowd Diver. And 6 Crowd Diver was insane. 6 Crowd Diver was great. You could win lobbies off of 6 Crowd Diver. We're going to sandwich that a little bit here. So 2 Crowd Diver gets a pretty substantial buff to 12%. You should be happy to run a 2 Crowd Diver Katarina early. And then 6 is coming down to 50%. All right, EDM, bit of a complicated trait here, and you'll see this is tied with other champion changes later. But right now, EDM 5, great. Probably too strong. Anything below EDM 5, not that great. So we're buffing 2 EDM to help you onboard into it a little bit. We're nerfing, it looks like a buff, but we're nerfing 5 EDM. It'll do more damage, but you won't get that extra 1-second cooldown that causes the spells to be really, really spammy. And then Jax was kind of like the best version of EDM right now, which a little overbuff here on our part last time. So the Jax base timer is going back to 8 seconds. But again, you'll see later with some champion changes, hopefully things like Lux and Zed are more playable. It's not a massive change to EDM or anything like that. All right, Emo. This is a big change. Emo was a trait that you played 2 a lot. 2 Emo Poppy, 2 Emo Annie, 2 Emo Vex. All great. Anything more, kind of a laugh. You're not playing more. So we're buffing the mana reduction and mana on ally death. So this is a trait that should be a lot more about gaining a bunch of mana, casting more often. The 6 piece is getting its AP bonus nerfed. But again, we want Emo to be a trait that you're willing to go vertical. And right now, you really don't. You never do. Executioner. This one's kind of confusing. This is meant to be a small buff to 6, about neutral to 4, and a little bit of a buff to 2. But the general idea with Executioner was, what it actually did was kind of confusing. You would get, let's say you're running 4 Executioner. You would get 25% critical strike damage. Cool if you have a bunch of IEs and stuff, but if not, it basically meant 25% chance to take advantage of your trait, which is not great. And then the critical strike, so like the 35%, was basically only maxed if your opponent was at 0 health. So if you start combat, you had 0 critical strike, and that would slowly scale up. So if they're at half health, you were only gaining 17% critical strike. Ugh. So if you didn't have things like IE, JG, or stuff like that would help you crit, or like Hodge or Guard Breaker, since you already crit, you were missing out on a lot of crit, and you were missing out on a lot of your trait. So we shifted that power. The critical strike damage is going down, but as you can see here, the crit strike chance is going way up, especially at 6. And yes, that says 200%. What that means is if your opponent is at half health, you're gaining 100% critical strike at 6, which is great because then some of that converts into critical strike damage with that old 2-to-1 ratio. So TLDR, Executioners should actually crit now because that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to crit. Cool. They'll crit more. Great. Guardian Vertical just wasn't that great. 5% buff at 4, 10% buff at 6. Should be easy. Should help them be a competitive frontline with something like with 6 Sentinel, stuff like that. So they'll have a lot of health. All right, Heartsteel. So Heartsteel is getting a bit of a nerf. At 5 and 7, you're going to see the heart multipliers go down from 2.5 to 2.25 and 6 to 5.5 respectively. But here's the new feature. If you've been watching my stream at all, maybe you've seen this. After 4 turns, you'll be presented with an option that you see here, cash out or raise the stakes. If you hit cash out, it's like you're playing the trait before. It's like it almost didn't change. So if you really like Heartsteel as is, just press cash out every time. No problem. The trait didn't change. But if you're somebody that likes those big, insane high roll games and likes to take risk for the 1 in a million shot, take raise the stakes. If you do, your box will turn golden, and you are now in raise the stakes mode. In this mode, you're gaining double the hearts, but if you win a combat, you'll lose half your hearts. Your objective is to lose 4 in a row. If you do, you'll get a bunch more hearts than normal. This will be good. If you can go another 4, same thing, you'll get a really big cash out with like an extra 100 hearts on top of that, multiplied by everything. So if you really want to go for that crazy YouTuber, you want to get Heartsteel in, 4 win, switch to 5 Heartsteel, 8 loss, and then have a grand old time. So, but realistically, our expectation is you will not see this in challenger lobbies. It's way too risky. You will go 8th. People will grief you. It is not meant to be like the way to play Heartsteel. It is meant to be kind of a for fun thing to kind of gamble around and get those crazy, crazy cash outs. So, okay, Hyperpop. Hyperpop is a trait that has kind of been non-existent. Like, obviously people play Lulu and Ziggs, but no one's really chasing vertical Hyperpop. So it's getting a really big buff here, actually. Almost double at 3 and 4 to the mana regeneration. And we're already seeing some strats emerge, by the way, where you run like 2 Lulus and they just feed each other with Hyperpop. So definitely some cool options, but we want to see Hyperpop be played, and that's kind of the point. Jazz. This is another trait that now with the emblem being gone, we can give a little extra power. So it's gaining a little bit more health at 3 and quite a bit more health at 4. So Jazz comps hopefully will start to make a comeback, get those wide traits and cool power from there, especially combined with the Lucian changes later. I'm hoping to see some Jazz comps make a rise again. 6 and 8 Sentinel. I'll be honest with you, I'm skeptical these needed a nerf, but I know the perception around them. This is one of those perception nerfs. We nerfed 6 slightly, went from 60 to 55, and 8 got nerfed pretty handily. 8 mostly getting nerfed because the emblems will be more accessible through things like portals. You know, if you get a Wandering Trainer portal with a Sentinel emblem, we don't want it to be an 8 Sentinel game every time. So the power did have to come down. That being said, you know, we're not seeing a ton of like 6 Sentinel anything but RE, so we'll see. But definitely is coming down, and this should help the perception of the 6 Sentinel frontline, and hopefully make things like Guardian and Bruiser a little bit more comparable. Finally, Spellweaver. 10-piece prismatic, basically no one... I mean, I think I've seen like 2 screenshots of it. It doesn't even like show up in our data for the most part because it's just so hard to hit. And yes, there will be new portals, but even when you did hit it, it was like, I gained a bunch of AP, So we're putting it back down to 9-piece. It'll be a gold. It's still there if you want to go like 9 Spellweaver. It's still 120% AP, which is great. But it is not a prismatic anymore, so it's coming down in power. Other than that, 7 Spellweaver gets a 10 AP buff. So if you want to go vertical Spellweaver, it should be a little bit better. Things like, you know, RE right now are mostly not being played with Spellweaver, so hopefully this will help that be an option. All right, on the champion side, Annie. This might look weird to you. You might be like, oh, they're finally nerfing Annie. Yes and no. This is meant to be an adjustment. The problem with Annie is if you have an Annie 2 on stage 2 with like 1 item, she's garbage. She's just terrible, just one of the worst, because she takes too long to ramp up to that empowered state where all of her power is. But if you had a 3-item Annie, she was as good as a 3 cost. You know, she could really carry some fights. She was great. We're shifting that power. So early game, her first fireballs, those are getting buffed. She's actually going to hit harder. So like a stage 2 Annie with a single Shojin, those first few casts, they're going to hit harder. But when she enters that empowered state, it won't be quite as powerful, little less attack speed, and that second fireball going down in damage. Again, total damage isn't actually going down that much. It's like a little bit. So I look at this as like actually pretty neutral. If anything, it might help you in the early game. But we wanted that power, like we wanted the 2-star Annie to be something you could actually play in stage 2 without saying, I must play Annie reroll. All right, Nami. So from here on out, you're going to see a lot of champion buffs, and it shouldn't be a surprise. Basically, if in your mind a champion is weak, we've probably buffed it. So let's start with Nami. Nami's pretty weak. You almost ignore this headliner completely if you're playing seriously. So Nami's going to cast more often, 15 mana off, which is great. Stun duration obviously comes down so that she doesn't stun lock champions, but she's going to cast more often. Her spell damage did not go down, so she can cast more and do more damage. Cool. Olaf. Olaf's going to do a bit more damage as well, and his missing health ratio conversion to attack speed is going to go up. So if you want to, for some reason, go 6 Bruiser, reroll Olaf with attack speed, cool, it'll be better. You'll get some more attack speed, though. This should help him be pretty strong in the early game. So, cool. Tom Kench, same thing. Another champion that you kind of mostly disregard. He's going to auto a little bit harder. Cool. So he'll actually in fights and gains 5 more armor and MR, making him a bit tanky. So, tankier Tom Kench. Cool. Tarek. This is one of the biggest buffs I've ever done, and I don't think it matters. His spell damage is being multiplied by 250%. Some of you might be going, wait, Tarek does spell damage? Yeah, turns out the way Tarek works is when he casts his shield, his next 2 autos did extra damage. They did laughable amounts of damage. Absolutely laughable amounts of damage. Now they're going to actually do some damage, not 0. So, cool. We've tested it a bit on PB. It's not, you're not going to see Tarek reroll. It's not going to be anything like that, but at least he'll actually like end a fight. Cool. Vi. Vi is another champion that, like, if you see a Mosh or Headliner Vi in your shop right now, you're like, never in a million years. Trying to change that a bit. So her spell damage is going to go way up from 220 to 330. If they have more health, it's going to go all the way up to 450. So that punch should actually start to hit a little bit. And let's be real, her recommended items were telling you to make her a tank. She's not really a tank. So we changed it to Attack Fighter to recommend things like Titan's Resolve, Sterix, IE, stuff like that, Bloodthirster. So, again, from what I've seen, I don't think this makes Vi like S tier or anything like that, but it should help the Punk comp a bit out in the early game as well. Speaking of which, Yasuo. Now, this one looks scary in isolation, but we'll talk about more changes later. But We want Yasuo reroll to be a thing. It was designed to be a thing. You should be able to play Yasuo reroll. Right now, you kind of can't. I mean, if everything goes perfectly, maybe, but realistically, no. So now per kill, he's going to get an extra 0.5% AD. From what we've seen on PBE, it can be a lot better now. So cool. Yasuo reroll might be a thing. Cool. All right, Bard. So I've played a lot of Bard, trying to test him out and see how he feels. He's okay until you're counting on him to do damage and he goes heal, heal, heal damage. And you're like, cool, bro. Especially because at 3-star, his heal doesn't scale that much. So you really don't want him to heal. And that variance can feel really bad. So we're making it so that every time he casts now, in a random order, it will be 3 damage and 1 heal. Yes, he can still tip for a gold. That's always a bonus. But this should help him be a more predictable carry. And we're buffing his spell damage a little bit. This should make Bard actually an option as an AP item holder. You should be in a good spot. So, cool. Base Garen. Base Garen, okay to meh. Some people say he's good, but you don't see people really fighting over Garen. The thing you'll see later is his headliner bonus was insane, 400 health early. We're going to be nerfing that later, you'll see in the patch, and putting that back in the base. So we don't want to nerf headliner Garen, but we do want to buff base and keep headliner the same. So 50 base HP, cool. And we're giving him a little bit more health on each cast. Maybe Garen reroll shows up. I kind of doubt it, but should like Garen be an option. Gragas is another one. Gragas, laughable damage. And yes, before the Redditors start saying, oh my god, they buffed Taric and Nami and Gragas, Disco's going to be OP. No, but it does help Disco. It will be stronger. That's kind of the point. Disco's not really a competitive comp. But Gragas can do some damage, and so who knows? Maybe headliner reroll Gragas can actually pump out some damage. Kai'Sa's another one. Kai'Sa's fine in stage 2, and then she falls off a cliff. So we're buffing her AD ratio a little bit. It's a very tiny buff. Her AP ratio a little bit, and this is to help her take advantage of KDA. If you want to play Kai'Sa with KDA, she should benefit from that a little bit more. And Kai'Sa will be doing Kai'Sa things. So, cool. Katarina. Katarina's another champion that was strong for like the first 3 days, and then people figured out how to play against it. The other thing is with that crowd diver nerf, I think the 6 crowd diver Katarina is basically non-existent. So we're going to give her some attack speed to let her hopefully throw some more shurikens and be another strong 2-cost carry. Cool. Kayle. Kale's an interesting one. Looking back on this, so this buff, debatable. I think there are some challenger players who will say Kayle doesn't need the buff. I know we've seen Dish Soap, for example, win lobbies with Kayle. It definitely can happen. What's interesting about this buff, though, is that most of the buff is in the finale damage, not the attack speed. So if you're thinking like Ginsu's, probably don't roll in Ginsu's. Things like, Jeweled Gauntlet, Archangel, stuff like that are probably going to be more advantageous, and you still have to buy the time. But we do want Kayle to be something that you're like excited to buy and willing to play. So Kayle will be strong. Good. Again, a lot of buffs this patch if you haven't detected the theme. Echo. Echo is a champion that basically goes in every comp. He has 3 amazing traits. Cool. We don't want to ruin that. But did you know Echo also does a massive AoE stun for 1.5 seconds? Why? I don't know. He probably doesn't need it. But for now, we're going to lower it down to 1 second duration. Hopefully, melee comps can actually not have to build Quicksilver every single game against an Echo, but we'll see. This is, again, meant to be a light nerf, and we'll go from there. Lux. Lux is a weird champion. Lux 3, pretty good. You can win lobbies with like 5 EDM Lux 3. Getting there is a pain, because Lux 2 and Lux 1, yeah, they're not great. So, Lux 1 and Lux 2, we're actually going to break our normal 50% spell framework here and just buff Lux 1 and Lux 2. She needs it. So hopefully Lux can be an item holder and an option you're willing to play. If you get a Lux out of a box, you're supposed to be like, sweet, I can play Lux, not, oh god, I hope I get 8 more or I'm going 8th. So, Mordekaiser, another one that like, okay, but I kind of want to get Headliner Mordekaiser to be something you're excited to play. And in order to do that, Headliner Mordekaiser needs to do damage. So we're buffing his base damage and his finale damage about 10%. Should be cool. Go Mordekaiser, rock on. All right, 4 costs. Ahri. Ari, clearly the most popular champion as we head into the final days of the patch. Clearly the thing I'm getting pinged the most about why haven't you nerfed Ari? Nerf Ari. And she does. She needs a small nerf. This might not be the nerf people are expecting. I think a lot of people were maybe expecting spell damage down, things like that. But the reality is this is probably the nerf she needs, and we'll start with this and then go from there. We don't want to kill Ari. But this will slow down her casts, right? She's going to be casting those giant single target nukes slower, right? Her typical build of Shojin Nashers, she's going to need a little bit more time between each one. That's going to be the start. If it's not enough, we'll go from there. But the problem is if she doesn't do much damage, then she can't win fights at all. That's the problem with making a 4-cost single target champion. But this should help bring her down to a bit more reasonable level. She's still a 4-cost. She's still meant to win games. Just maybe not quite as many as she's winning right now. Karthus. This is an interesting one, and I think a pretty debatable one. But Karthus, we're lowering his starting mana a little bit just to slow him down a notch. And right now, Karthus is generally perceived as weak. There's a couple niche builds out there, but generally perceived as weak. But we're changing him, especially because if you get him early, he's really bad. It's like, ooh, spread out a bunch of damage to no one. Who cares? Hitting 5 targets lightly, not as great. So we're lowering it to 4 targets, but that letting him hit those 4 targets harder, right? So he might actually be able to kill people with his spell cast. Cool. And if you hit 3-star, that's going to jump up to 6, hopefully helping 3-star Karthus actually kill a few things. So generally, this is meant to be perceived as a very light buff and allowing him to actually focus fire a couple targets down rather than just spreading out a bunch of useless damage, and hopefully makes him less dependent on KDA Akali. So hopefully we can see some Karthus stuff. This combined with the Executioner changes, maybe Karthus becomes a carry. Twisted Fate. Very small buff to Twisted Fate, 5 damage, mostly a buff to TF1, if anything. But the bigger buff here is that his attack speed ratio was kind of laughably bad. You would look at his tooltip and be like, oh, he scales off attack speed. Disco and Ginsu's are great for him. They weren't. They were a trap. You should not be building Ginsu's or Disco on him. They were pointless. We're fixing that. Now, we're doubled it basically, so he'll actually scale okay with attack speed. If you want to run a Ginsu's Twisted Fate with Disco, I've seen, that 21 card spell go all the way up to like 36 cards now. So hopefully that allows you to have more interesting itemization on Twisted Fate and actually take advantage of his trait. Cool. Viego, really small buff here. We didn't want to over buff all of Pentakill because it feels like every Pentakill is getting a buff. But Viego is kind of one of the weaker 4-costs. We're letting him do more damage with his dive. The idea here is if he does more damage, you can build more defensive stuff. So stuff like Titan plus BT plus Sterix might be an okay option and allow him to do a lot of damage and go repeat. So, cool. And then finally, Zac. Zac is getting a few more buffs here. A, to make up for some of the EDM changes, and B, just to make Zac actually comparable to someone like Set. Because right now, if you have a 2-star Set and a 2-star Zac, you're probably playing the Set. So hopefully that changes here. 10 less mana, 10 more armor and MR, and a little bit of extra heal. We always have to be careful with the spell heal, though, because if you sample Zac, all the other EDM people heal also, which can get really annoying. But we'll keep an eye on it. So, Zac buffs. Lucian. So Lucian, I want to call out here. We've obviously seen the feedback around Lucian that, he feels like a 2-cost and isn't very good. So we are buffing his AD ratios. Now, I've gone on record as saying the attack speed bug wasn't that impactful. And in most cases I was right, but I was wrong in one case, and I want to call that out. If you can get him a lot of attack speed, he actually scales up pretty well with it. So this means like 4 rapid fire Lucian, pretty good. Ginsu's actually not the worst item on Lucian. And when you get him up to like 4.0 attack speed now, it looks pretty cool. He's just like, yes, that was a sound effect. Enjoy that. So hopefully this makes Lucian feel like a 5-cost. Cool. But yeah, also I like the fact that now there's a Ginsu's holder in the late game that isn't Sona. So Ginsu's Lucian, kind of an option as well. But Lucian should be better. Cool. Kiana. Kiana is the best 5-cost in the game because once you get her, not only does she do a ton of damage, she generates a ton of item value in fights and spawns more items. That's pretty good. And we'll keep it good, but maybe not quite as good. Kiana 2 will now only generate 1 item instead of 2. You don't really need 2 Warmogs every time she casts. That's a little much. And we're lowering the damage a little bit, especially on the itemless one. If you were hitting an itemless champion with Kiana, she was one-shotting them really hard with extra true damage. So she didn't need that much. Honestly, this nerf, it looks big, but it's pretty light. From what we've seen on PvE, Kiana's still insane. She still generates a bunch of items. So I don't think this is going to remove Kiana from the meta, but she will be down in power. Sona. Sona, to quote Dish Soap, you don't pretend the game is balanced, you just click attack speed. Okay, cool. Well, let's try to balance it a little better. So attack speed's going down a little bit. You'll get less attack speed per auto and less attack speed, per once she casts. But we're going to buff the heal form. The heal will do more per auto, and the damage form giving more AP per auto. So those two forms should be a little bit better. Hopefully this gets it to closer to a decision. Again, we're not trying to delete the attack speed one or anything like that, but we are trying to get Sona to a point where it should be an interesting decision, not assume attack speed. And finally, Ziggs. Probably one of the bigger buffs here as well, but Ziggs, when that scaling bomb went from 2 to 1, it kind of gutted him a bit. He ended up being way too weak. So we're giving him some attack speed back. He's getting that hyper pop buff, and those small bombs are going to go up in damage quite a bit here. This is a big buff to those small bomb damage. He's still only scaling 1 per cast, but Ziggs can actually output the damage now and be a 5 cost. So hopefully the 5 cost balance ends up in a pretty good spot here. All right, headliners. I'll go through this quick. Evelyn headliner, 5 AP buff. Olaf headliner, 5 armor and MR buff. Tom Kench headliner, 75 HP buff. Tarek headliner, 50 HP buff. Vi headliner, 100 HP buff, 5 AD nerf. She doesn't really need more AD. She's already got that through Punk. But the extra flat HP will make her better in the early game. Yasuo, this is another one. I think this is a bigger nerf than people realize, but minus 5% Omnivamp, but plus 100 health. So now you're going to actually need to build an Omnivamp item on him, or 2 even, to let him go infinite. But he's not going to get that built in through the trait. Felios, 5% AD buff. Garen, 50 HP nerf. As we saw, that just went back into the champion, so Garen's kind of neutral. Gnar, this is a big one. The jump slightly delayed to after initial enemy targeting. There were times where it was possible for Gnar to jump so fast that he was just the first target and would die. Not anymore. It's been fixed. Gragas, 3% more damage on the headliner. Nico, this is one of my favorite changes. Nico used to give 20 mana to ally. Now it'll give 40. So this is pretty cool if you want like a headliner Nico to give mana to somebody else. Also, I know I'm sure Leduc's going to create some crazy comp where you run like 4 Nikos with the prismatic augment that gives them all this ability, but should be fun. That's kind of the point. Have fun. Zac headliner, realistically, very few people playing Zac headliner. 100 more HP, 5 more AP. And then Kayn was another headliner that really just wasn't benefiting enough. The increased rewards are cool, but he didn't have much extra power to get those increased rewards. So we're giving him 5 more AP. So lots of light adjustments here, mostly buffs. Augments. Cybernetic Bulk 1, 2, and 3. Little too good for just how easy they are to play and how good they always are. So those are going down 10%. On the silver side of things, Best Friends 1 gets 2 more armor and MR, or armor, MR, and attack speed. No MR. Attack speed and armor. Consistency. Because of the streak changes, this augment is terrible. And we don't need you to pick a terrible choice. And we all don't need to load up tactics.tools Wednesday morning and see a 33% top 4 rate augment or something. Nope, it's disabled. Help is on the way. A little too good for a silver. Delaying it 2 turns. Rolling for days, +1 reroll, and now can show up on 4-2 if you really need some rerolls. Stationary support, 1 more extra turn. Small nerf. Crash test dummies. This augment, still way too good, no matter how many times we nerf the dummy. Stun duration going down to 1.25 seconds. It's still a ton of extra frontline. I still think this augment's going to be great. Just a little less stun. Executioner, expose weakness. 40% shred and sunder was way too good. This augment, especially if you got it with like the twin comp with Twitch and Vex, too good. Nerfing it to the standard 30%. Extended play gets buffed, where now you get 2 gold whenever a punk is 2-starred. Should help if you want to play punk reroll. Heroic grab bag, little weak, 2 extra gold. Little buddies, a little too good. 15 less health per buddy now, so nerf to that augment. Ramping rhythm, 1 extra starting stack. Hopefully this makes rapid fire a lot more fun. I think starting with 4 stacks can be pretty insane, actually, so we'll see if we see some ramping rhythm comps. Return on investment, only 16 rerolls now instead of 18. So if you want that Tactician's Crown from return on investment, you can play that. Submit to the Pit. This was a good augment, but it was really weird because it was mostly around enemies surrounding you and very unintuitive. Now it's going to play like Keepers, where it's just, as long as you start near allies at the start of combat, gain all those stats. Should be easier to use now is kind of the goal here. Teaming Up 2. This augment, if you could get this augment at 3-2, was insane, especially if you spiked a really good 4 cost. Now this augment only shows up on 4-2. 3's a crowd, little too good still, minus 5 HP. Binary airdrop. This does not change anything. It now just actually says it's a recommended item. A lot of confusion around if it was random or recommended. It's not random. It's recommended. Cool. Tiniest Titan Plus, 7 extra gold. Cool. So yeah, not a ton in the augment space. Minor stuff there. All right, items. This is probably a big batch of changes you'll want to pay attention to. Right now, I think there are items that people build pretty clearly, pretty often. Blue buff, red buff, stuff like that. IE. And then there are items that pros would tell you, don't ever build these. These are terrible. They're garbage. We're going to buff a lot of the terrible ones here to get them along the lines. So Adaptive Helm gets 5 more MR, armor and MR in the front line, 5 more AP in the back line, and Radiant buff to match. Archangels gives 5 more AP every 5 seconds. So Archangels gets a buff. Cool. And is Radiant. Bloodthirster. Now, we saw success with blue buff when we added AD to it. We'll probably do a little bit more of that here and there. Bloodthirster now grants 15 AP. That is less than the AD it normally gives. But if you want to go Bloodthirster Kane, for example, great. You'll get some AP from it. Cool. Radiant also does the same thing. Blue buff, very tiny nerf here. The damage goes down to 8%. The blue buff versus Shojin comparisons is a little not favorable for Shojin, but we want to be careful that a lot of its stats are being propped up by Ari, so we don't want to over-nerf this. Small nerf. Dragon's Claw, 5% HP becomes 10% HP. This is a pretty big amount of HP that you can get that scales late game. A 3-star set with a Dragon Claw now. Whew, it's going to be dangerous. So hopefully Dragon's Claw, not a terrible item to build anymore. Even Shroud, 5 more armor and MR. This one might be contentious because I think a lot of people are like, Even Shroud's built all the time. But we were seeing in our data it looked pretty low, and 5 more armor and MR is not going to hurt it in the early game, so should be fine. Gargoyle Stoneplate now grants 100 HP. So if you want to put it on a Sentinel, it won't be as bad. 100 HP plus its stats should be fine. Radiant also grants 250 HP and 20 more armor and MR, because Radiant Gargoyle Stoneplate now doesn't have to be balanced around Demacia Galio, so we can get that back up to other Radiant items. Hextech Gunblade, 5 more AD and AP, and then the Radiant gets a bunch more to make it a bit more, you can put it on anybody, so Radiant Gunblade better. Ionic Spark, this is probably one of the biggest buffs here, but Ionic Spark is meant to be an item that goes on a tank, but it doesn't really help you tank that much. 200 flat health, that's a big buff. Should be a good item now. 400 health for the Radiant version. Cool. Jeweled Gauntlet, 5 more AP, 10 more at Radiant. Buffs. Okay, here's a big one. Morellonomicon, widely considered the why would you build this instead of red buff, now comes with 15% attack speed. This is a buff, right? Like now you'll be able to, you could use this instead of Nashers. It's just general attack speed if you need the burn. So this should make it a lot more comparable to things like Nashers if you want to build that and get that burn. Cool. Another big one here, Rabadon's Death Cap. The problem with Rabadon's Death Cap is if you had AP, you never wanted this item. So we're changing that. It'll lose 10 AP, but gain 12% damage. This is much more multiplicative, so things like Spellweavers should want Death Cap now. When someone saw this, they're like, man, this will be best in slot on casters now. And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of the point. It's the AP item. You put it on the casters. Good. So, Radiant gets matched also. This Radiant version with 50% damage might be a little bonkers. We'll see. So, but yeah, Death Cap. Cool. Red buff, another small nerf to match blue buff. Damage goes from 8% to 6%. The Radiant one, though, loses 10% attack speed and 2% damage as well. Radiant was really good. Radiant red buff was the best item in the game, other than True Damage Emblem, which we'll get to in a second. Also, that's a typo, so we'll get to that. Radiant Crown Guard, 10% more starting shield. Radiant Steadfast Heart, more DR. True Damage Emblem, this should say no longer has a bling bonus. Ignore the base armor and MR. I can't type. True Damage Emblem is losing its bling bonus. It's losing its 10% damage. So True Damage Emblem will go down in power a lot. That item was too good. It shifted power too much. Nerfed. Great. Ignore the bad typing. Bad Mort. All right, now we have small stuff. Small stuff is changes that we don't expect to change the meta, but do need to happen. So, first off, we have the prismatic traits, 10 KDA, 10 pentakill, 9 true damage. These traits are going to happen more, right? With the spatula portal, with the wandering trainer portal, with different portals like that. They're going to happen more. Because they're going to happen more, they can't quite be as good. So each of them is getting a small nerf here. They are still meant to be very, very good, but maybe it'll actually be a little closer now in certain fights. So they're each going down a little bit here. I think 10 KDA gets the biggest of the nerfs. Pentakill, small nerf, 9 true damage, bit of a nerf there. Country, again, with the emblem being craftable, we wanted to nerf it a little. That being said, it's not like we're seeing 7 country dominate the meta right now or anything. So 5 armor and MR off Hecarim, and then 10 armor and MR off at 7. So nothing crazy. KDA, a little too good at 3, little mediocre at 7. 3 goes from 10 to 9. 7 goes from 22 to 24. Minor. And Zig's superfan item is going from Archangels to Spear of Shojin, intended to be a buff if you ever run superfan Ziggs. Cool. Champion side, Corki. Corki's spell is getting a bit of a nerf. Again, this is mostly compensation for the 8-bit buff, meant to be neutral for Corki. Maybe even a little bit of a buff at like 4 8-bit. Evelyn, another champion, not really that exciting. Gets a little bit more attack speed when she spell casts. Hopefully lets her keep going and be pretty strong in the early game. Cool. Cassante, little too good for also being a Heartsteel unit. It's going to lose 5% of his spell DR. From what we've seen on PBE, he's still good. Maybe just dies a little quicker. Cool. Lilia, 10 less mana. Cast a little quicker. Cast a little more often. Not going to change Lilia dramatically. Jax, yes, he got the EDM nerfs, but it wasn't quite enough. We gave him the tiniest spell nerf here. This is like slap on the wrist, but not even a slap, more like a touch on the wrist. 230 base down to 220 base. So just putting him down. Again, we don't need him to be the best EDM champion. He should still be good, should still be playable. Nothing crazy. Pantheon, on the other hand, gets a little bit more DR, so trying to help Punk a little bit here. So that should help him. Scales with AP as well, so if you want to put like a Crown Guard on Pantheon, it'll be pretty good. Twitch, this is a confusing one, but Twitch's proportions were a little weird in that he really scaled well with like crit and even AP. So we're trying to change that so that he really benefits from Punk and a little less from just like generic stuff. So his spell is going to get higher AD ratio, but less secondary explosions, and the secondary explosions are the things that scale off AP. So there should be a buff to deep Punk Twitch is the goal here. Lulu, very tiny nerf here, or buff. Words are hard. Very tiny buff here to make Lulu a little bit more playable. It's very tiny. We've got to be careful with Hyper Pop getting buffed here, but super tiny. Misfortune, same thing. Spell hits a tiny bit harder. Again, very light. That's why they're in small. Nico gets a little bit more shield value from an ally. If you want to run 3-star Nico with a 3-star Kaisa, cool. You'll get 1% more of their health. Cool. Caitlyn. This ended up actually being, again, neutral. The goal here was to nerf her spell AD a little bit to compensate for 8-bit, and then buff the AP ratio a little bit in case you had things like Ginsu's, that she could actually take advantage of a little bit of that AP. But overall, meant to be about neutral for Caitlyn. Poppy, very tiny nerf to the heal. Poppy is kind of the best tank when you get it going. Very tiny nerf. Thresh, 50 HP buff, just to put him comparable to some of these other 4-cost tanks. Very minor. And then bug fixes. Endless Hordes will no longer delete items from training dummies. Cool. Fixed a bug where Karthus could target untargetable objects like Zed clones. That's a buff to Karthus. And then probably the biggest one that will hopefully help all of our double up and hyper roll players. Craftable emblems will no longer roll into abyssal masks from Pandora's items or reforgers in double up and hyper roll. Definitely the most reported bug. Apologize for that. Now you might be wondering, why not more bug fixes? We just got back from break with a day to lock the patch. Hopefully we'll get some more bug fixes for you next patch. But this is what you get for now. And yeah, so... All right, so there you go. Like I said, pretty sizable patch, pretty big, but should be fun. Hopefully opens up a lot more lines. If anything changes between now and Wednesday, I'll let you know. Otherwise, that's about it. So that's going to do it for me this time. The words are hard. That's going to do it for me. Until next time, take it easy.